All right, time's up. Thank you so much. All right, now we are going to read, we have, in Shelby County, we've been able to find 36 victims of lynchings. Some victims were, and Margaret can probably tell you more precisely, there weren't 36 separate lynchings for each victim. Some lynchings had multiple victims. And on our website, lspmem.org, lynchingsitesmem.org, you can find the stories of those victims to the extent that we know them and their locations on the map throughout Shelby County. And now we'd like to read the names of those victims. So me, Rich Watkins, and I'm going to ask the rest. There's going to be 3 more people, and they're going to introduce themselves right before they begin speaking. Unknown, January 1st, 1851. Unknown, March 1862. Jeremiah Hale, June 25th, 1867. Frank Jones, November 18th, 1867. Unknown, January 1868. Christopher Bender, Bud Whitfield, July 30th, 1868.
Jessica Oriens. Thank you. John M. Bell, December 26, 1868. Wash Henley, January 15, 1869. John W. Schofield, July 15, 1870. John Brown, August 18, 1872. John West or John White, April 27, 1875. Jesse Jones, January 22nd, 1885. Jim Eastman, August 31st, 1887.
And Margaret Vandiver, Calvin McDowell, Thomas Moss, and William Stewart, March 9, 1892. Richard Neal, February 11, 1893. Lee Walker, July 22nd, 1893. Warner Williams, Daniel Hawkins, Robert Haynes, Edward Hall, John Hayes, Graham White, August 31st, 1894. Luther Billings, October 10th, 1905. Pat Crump, June 2nd, 1911. William Johnson, February 15th, 1912.
I ran the gamble, I guess, to save the best for last. El Person, May 22nd, 1917. Lawrence Shepard, September 24th, 1917. That's got a different date. Tommy Williams, September 28th, 1927. Henry Ross, January 2nd, 1933. Of course, I'm familiar. Jesse Lee Bond, April 28th, 1939.
Thank you for reading that. We'd like to pay homage to those whose memory we are trying to memorialize and to bring forth to the wider community. Again, I'm Rich Watkins. I'm president of the board of the Lynching Sites Project. I have been active with LSP since maybe 2019-ish, something like that. I took a trip one December to Montgomery, to the National Memorial of Peace and Justice, also known as the Lynching Site Memorial. And I was just moved by that experience. And I turned to my wife and said, I really would like to be a part of whoever is doing this work in Memphis, and she said she had heard about it called the Lynching Sites Project. And so I started attending the meetings in January of that next year and met some of the very fine people that you're about to meet. I'm a native Memphian. I went to school and started the early part of my career in other parts of the country before moving back in 2016. It's good to be home and good to be aligned with these good people. I'm just going to ask actually everyone to just say their names quickly. For those, and while you're here, how do you find out about us? For those who are in LSP, you can say, hey, I've been coming to LSP meetings since whatever, and what you've done with us and what you get out of being with us. So, Margaret, if you don't mind.
Margaret Vandiver, I've been involved with LSP since 2015, as this gentleman next to me. And I've done a lot of the research on the various cases.
I am Randy Gamble. I've been involved with it since November 2015. Thank you for Dr. Margaret Vandiver that did a lot of our research ahead of time.
And I'm Wayne Dowdy with the Memphis Public Library, and I've known Randy Gamble way too long.
And I'm Ken Austin. I've been involved with the Lynching Sites Project since 2015.
I'm Carl Austin.
Okay. My name is Carolyn Michael Banks. I'm the owner of a tour, Possibilities, an African American history tour here in Memphis, and became involved with Lynching Sites Project in my discussion of on the tour of what work that you do.
I'm Fred Morton. I've been with MSP since 2017 with the Memorial Bill Personals.
I'm Ann Carrier. I moved back to Memphis in 2018 and got involved soon after.
I'm Charles Miller. I'm a retired engineer. I manufactured through the Bunny Clip Home, in Mason, Tennessee. And I volunteer with the Dowdy Museum in Mississippi. I published their newsletter.
I'm Dave Marshall. I've been involved with LSP since 2015.
My name is Paul Israel. I've been involved off and on for 7 years with MSP. I attended the health back in 2017.
DJ12, I started coming to the meeting around 19 because after this case. And of course, I've been involved in civil and human rights since 1966.
I'm Sam McDaniel. I've been involved with LSP since 2017.
I'm Clarence Christie.
I am Denise Hooks, and I learned about LSP just recently, and I'm interested in.
I'm Samuel Taylor. Actually learned about it from
I'm Linda O'Neill, and I'm a frequent visitor to the LSP website, doing some research for said their names, prayer group at St. Patrick's Church downtown.
Virginia Chloe, and I've been a member since 2020 and involved with the Memorial Bill Project.
My name is Susan Penn. And was first exposed to LSP, not to LSP, but I went to a courageous conversation that was guided by students from Overton High School and several high schools, but they had a courageous conversation with the invited. But then later, before the pandemic, Marilyn introduced introduced me to the committee that Rich was leading at that time, which was to bring a duplicate monument from the memorial in Montgomery to Shelby County, but that work was interrupted.
I'm curious, Scott, I've known about LSP since 2017, from also Randy's neighbor. I hear all about LSP. And I met Randy at Fox Christie, and I've been in and out, went more when it was at the church on Poplar. And did a couple of times over at the university, but it was interrupted during the epidemic. And I've just recently become more a little involved. I'd like to get more involved again.
Thank you, everyone, for introducing yourselves. When I first started coming, I would see Margaret, and the first person I met, of course, was Randy. And just to say a few words about Randy, Randy is our ambassador. And if we meet someone, tell them that we're associated with LSP, I met a Randy Gamble, because Randy has already laid the groundwork when I was in Maryland, northern suburb of Maryland, and two people who I'd never met before said, yes, I met Randy Gamble. So we appreciate Randy. We enjoy what he does for us. It's definitely needed. He is our goodwill ambassador. I'm actually going to give you the presentation I gave a couple of months ago about what we do. And in essence, it is community-based memory work. Where I gave this presentation in Maryland at Goucher College, which is in the northern suburbs outside Baltimore, was sponsored by the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project. And they got their start. Everyone pretty much has a seed with EJI and the work that Brian Stevenson had done. And just to move forward, here are our founders, Randall Mullins and Sharon Pavelda. And you see, founded in 2015, Brian Stevenson gave a talk here in Memphis and challenged, and he laid out this challenge across the United States for communities to recognize and memorialize these victims of racial violence. And our founders were there, and they took up the call. So the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project also got its start. They did something that was very, very good, and it happens when you live in a blue state. Even though they had a Republican governor, they actually got legislation passed where they had a committee, like a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and there are now like lynching memorial societies in the counties, in most of the counties in Maryland, to memorialize those victims. So this conference was a gathering of those county memorial projects in Maryland, and they invited certain other memorial project groups across the nation to attend and to present, and we were one of them. We were very honored to get that invitation. And right behind it, you see that there in front of the link, the marker that we have for held persons that some of you talked about attending in 2017. And I admit sometimes I accidentally say 2017 as opposed to 2015 as I found it, because I know this was our big first public event that people definitely remember, and it was on the centennial of Mr. Person's murder. So the main thing we do, or one of the things we do, the thing that really kicked us off was placing markers to memorialize these victims. And it really began with a lot of the work that Margaret Vanderburg did, along with others, to find out, who these victims were, where it happened, who was involved. So a lot of many years of work. And there are members now who live in other parts of the nation who continue to do research on this. And these are just public historians who just, they have an interest in it, and they're moved by it, and they want to find out what happened to honor these victims. Here are our goals. Identify the victims and sites and place markers, cultivate relationships with our community partners, foster courageous conversations. I think someone earlier said they attended one of our courageous conversations. Remain grounded in prayer, humility, and listening, building relationships of trust and due understanding with all those who want to be a part of this work. Make available written records as well as audio and video recordings, like in, of descendants of both lynching victims and those who were involved in the present at these lynchings. These are our goals. On the left there, you'll see a photo of our monument at UJI down in Montgomery. Here are the markers and the research that we have. We read the names. These are the ones that we have confirmed, or they're markers like either already established or they have been approved and not yet erected. Some of these you may have seen. The unknown is on 2nd Street by Sheraton. That is the unknown victim of 1851. Interesting thing about that one is a lot of, probably the lion's share of lynchings in the United States happened Reconstruction post. This one was even before the Civil War, 1851. Wash Henley, Calvin McDowell, Thomas Boston, William Stewart. These were the People's Grocery Store victims that Ida B. Wells talked about. We have that marker approved. I'll talk about this for a second. We have that marker approved and it was originally going to go up in, I believe, Booker T. Washington Park, which is up also 2nd Street, up north past the Carriage District. And we're placing it there because we like to place our markers on city property. If it's on private property, I mean, the owners, they can sell and do whatever they want. And we like our markers to be on city-owned property or Shelby County government property. So that was the nearest city-owned property to where we believed the lynching took place. And we believed it took place just south of the brewery there. It's not Wiseacre, there's a brewery there now, the name of which I can't think of. Like a year or so passed, and the city, we went there to scout for our augmented reality app, which I get to in a second. And we noticed that the city had bought a path from Booker T. Washington Park to a new site that had been cleared. And according to our researchers, it is that site, that was the actual site of the lynching. So now we are going back to the city to get the site moved to that actual spot. So we found that out earlier this year. So we were just surprised. It was very serendipitous that we found that. Now you guys may know, if you're familiar with some of the markets in town, there is a People's Grocery Store marker already about the 4-way grill, and that is what the store was. Okay. And some people have said, why did they take it down? What's going on? They took it down because there were just a number of misspellings and grammatical errors in the sign. And so they took it down to correct that. What's taking so long? Siwa also does that, right?
I think so.
Right.
So, yes.
And Siwa also does our markers and pandemic. You kind of heard that earlier today. The pandemic really disrupted their operations there. There have been delays in getting back. But they didn't take it down for nefarious reasons, just to correct some errors. Okay, so hopefully it'll be up soon. All right. Lee Walker, 1893. Pat Crump, we have that one approved. That was near the, why do I keep on to say Allison Salmon? What is the Mallory neighborhood? And there's a public park over there. L Persons, which we just saw by the putt-putt. We know that where that location is. And we have 18 cases that we know of, 18 other lynchings that we know of, and 28 other victims. Some of them we need to do more research on. Go ahead, Pam.
That's 46.
It's 46, I'm sorry?
Or 18 cases were searched. And then 20, I was adding up, but you.
Right, there are multiple victims in some of the
Okay.
lynchings. That, yeah, I know it can get confused. I used to get that confused as well. That is a picture from the 2017 ceremony for elk persons. And I really like this photo because you just see the multicultural, multi-faith aspect of the work. We do these ceremonies when there is a marker that's completed and erected. We have the dedication ceremony. We have a podcast. The second season, we've recorded 4 episodes of the second season so far. Hopefully, hoping to launch early next year. The second season, that is. The first season is on wherever you get podcasts. You can find it by searching for the Lynching Sites Project in Apple Music, for instance, or Apple Podcasts, rather, even on Google. And the purpose of the podcast is another form of memorialization of the victims. Me and Laura Faith Cabete in the first season, we interview our researchers on the work that they did, tell the story of what happened and its effects on today's society. And we also talk about what these researchers did in doing their research, because we think, when I was younger, history was, you only took it because you had to take it. And it wasn't until you were older that you realized, oh man, history is really, really cool. And so we want young people to know that history is approachable. And then you can also do this research. It's way more approachable now than when probably all of us were kids. Digital records on digital histories online. They didn't have any of that. I remember going to where the main library was on Central, using the microfiche room, right? And it's way easier now. But yeah, check out the podcast, listen to the stories. Symposium. Year before last, or was it last year? It was last year. We had a symposium on the elk persons lynching to raise awareness of what happened to elk and to educate people on its importance on the national level. Because one of our efforts is to get the elk person site into the National Park Service. We co-wrote a letter with Representative Cohen to send to President Biden. It's on President Biden's desk. To get the site into the National Park Service under the Antiquities Act. And afterward, we can talk about how things get into the National Park Service, but that's one of the ways. The other way is to get it in through legislation. And I gave testimony before Congress on this committee, explaining the importance of the elk persons site. So the symposium had a number of panelists and different sessions and workshops on the importance of the elk persons. Augmented reality mobile application. Here again, it's another app that you can find on the App Store. You can find it by searching Lynching Sites Project. And if you look at, let's go really quickly, as you can see. These are stills from the app. When you open it up, you'll see there on the far left what pops up. Similar to our website, you'll have a marker where the lynchings are, and of course it has GPS, so you know where you are in relation to the markers. You'll have a summary of the lynching there, how to get there, the directions, as you can see. So here on Start Experience, this next one to the last, you line up your phone with the marker, and then you press Start Experience. And what you start hearing is narration of the story. But for this particular one, we actually have audio of a witness to the lynching, and you'll start to hear his story. Okay? In other sites, we only have 5 sites. We had a grant to do this, and so we don't have so much money. So we have 5 sites we've done so far with the help of Code Crew. They did similar technology with St. Jude with the artwork that the kids do along our hallways. On some of them, if you have the app, you can line it up and they're drawings, paintings, animated. And so they helped us out with this. The augmented reality portion, you'll see here, you guys probably can't see it, but in here, there are these little figures. We call them humanoids. They don't have you can't tell their faces or whatever. They're just these dark, pixelated forms. And along where the putt-putt is, there used to be a road, okay, and a bridge. The bridge is no longer there, and the footprint of that road, the power lines, thank you. The power lines are still there, and it goes to the Wolf River. Okay. Oh, all right, yeah. Let's go over here. Yeah. So if you're there at El Persons, we have these humanoid figures walking along that path. There's only so far you can go because you get into private land. But if you read the description of the lynching, they talked about how many people were there and how it lined the road. And so we wanted to put people in that position and how it felt. Our goal is, for those of you who have not gone there, the actual site is very woody. And the last time I was there, it was in January, where there were no snakes. And we cut down a lot of it to get there. There's a path, you have to go behind
But fence.
right by the fence. And but there is a path there that you could get to. And the idea is to have it so they can go there as well. So that's the augmented reality. Let me go back. Another thing up here, just quick okay. Okay, these are community meetings. Our typical community meetings are like this. We're at the Barth House right now. We've been at Caritas. We've been at First Baptist on Poplar East Parkway. We've been at Idlewild, and now we are at the. Yes, my daughter attends the Idlewild Elementary, so that's why she spoke up. Now we're at the Barth House, and our community meetings in their form and structure have changed a bit because of COVID. And for those of you who are long-time guests, we are starting to morph back beginning next year to what we used to do before COVID, and with a lot of more of the influence of Sharon Velda, that how she used to do our meetings. We are going to be bringing more of that back. But you'll see that is Jeffrey Robinson, a native Mintian, who has a documentary out. We had him speak before us. And there we have Dr. Catherine Meeks, spoke just, a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. She'll be here in February. A few people mentioned courageous conversations. These are group conversations on difficult topics on race, racism, and our experiences dealing with social inequality.
Rich,
Go ahead,
I
Randy.
just want to add something on the list, on the previous screen,
Mm-hmm.
we have the quote project.
Quilting project, I'm so sorry. I forgot about that. The people associated with the quote project, raise your hand. We have 2 of them right here. And Virginia, would you mind saying a few words about what
All of
you guys
it.
do?
Okay, we're making a memorial quilt for all of the victims. And last week we were at Davy's Manor Plantation Quilt Show. We got 18 people signed up to make blocks. And the outreach was really great as well. Lots of people stopped by our booth that were not quilters and signed up to get emails and whatever from our group. And of course, Randy was there to tell them all about what was going on with the project. It was a very, very successful 3 days.
We were tired 3 days later.
Yes.
And could you say more about what we're asking people to do with their blocks?
Okay, I give out a packet that, with the instructions about what to do with the blocks, and then they send them back to me, and that's something else that I had forgotten. At Davies, they asked us to start, quilting bee or sewing bee at the first of the year, for people to meet one day a week and, either work on blocks or work on quilting this quilt when we get all the blocks together.
Thanks. And sorry about that. I did not mean to forget that. And as you can see, I did talk about it when we were in Maryland. You, okay? And I shared with the group, there's another, quilting, of course, is a part of our culture. And in Maryland, there was another woman who was doing a quilting project. She's doing a quilt for each state. And she's using the leaves of the state trees. It's like a backdrop for a quilt. And some of the states actually have multiple quilts because of, they just had so many victims. I believe Mississippi had 3 quilts, and one of them was just solely unknown names. So the future. Yes. So here's what for the future, we're going to continue doing what we have been doing. Of course, marker placements for the other murders that we know about. Expanding our augmented reality app to include more sites as we gain more funding. And we would like to have a Jesse Lee Bond symposium, a target of next year, 2024, hopefully 25, excuse me, Jesse Lee Bond. So you can see the soil collection, which is something that was started with EJI. If you've been down there in Montgomery, they have ours as well. And we have these stored with one of our longtime friends and LSP members. Also, the future to continue to elevate the Elk Person site to be a part of the National Park Service. Give more tours on local history. This summer, we gave a couple of tours. And I guess this is something that we can work with you on as well. Hey, we gave it where we aren't used to doing that, but a group reached out to us and was like, hey, let's do this. So more tours on local history and lynching sites, but also giving more classroom instructions and presentations. As we know, living in Tennessee, they have passed a law where in public schools, teaching subjects like these has become difficult, to say the least. But this summer, we have the opportunity to present classes to visiting students, to Idlewild, as a matter of fact, with Memphis Youth Ministries, right? And they come to Memphis for like a week and do social service projects. And Mary McIntosh, one of our members, board members, developed an hour or so long presentation. And I guess my students were like middle school, high school. I don't know, Randy, I don't know if your kids were around that age as well. And it was about what, 4 or 6 weeks, wasn't it? Yeah, it was like 6 weeks. And so we kind of took turns throughout those 6 weeks giving this instruction. And so we'd like to more formalize that and also be able to give it to corporations as well. Some who want to do DE&I efforts and to learn more about what happened in this area. Oh, remember the brush I was talking about with the Elk Person's actual site? This is it. That's the abutment where the bridge used to go across. We are not 100% sure this is the abutment that was used when he was lynched. But it's one of the remaining abutments of the bridge that used to cross over the Wolf River. But you can see how thick it is now. But if you can imagine there being thousands of people in that area to witness this event. And we've seen that gap still. So that is what we do, what we have been doing and what we plan on doing. We have a couple of projects ongoing that we love for more people to volunteer on. We've heard about some of the Fulton project. We have an education committee, so developing curriculum, things of that nature. And of course, after the meal, after Wayne's talk, we'll be happy to talk more about some of the things that we do. Question before we get to Wayne?
Yeah, I want to make sure.
Questions and comments? Go ahead.
That we recognize Elaine Turner. Brian. 2016, 20 of us went on a tour because of your nephew drove the bus, election tour.
Fred?
Yeah, what's some of the target activities of the bond symposium? I mean, this has been a really challenging situation in a lot of ways, but what's that symposium? What form is that going to take? Can you say anything about that?
Well, not much, because that's why I said, what, 2025? So we have some time, because as you know, Fred, well, let me talk about what we covered with L persons. I mean, we kind of want to use that as a template for Jesse to move on. For L persons, we had, and yeah, I'm not super great with names, but one of the first presenters was she's the prosecutor, I'm sorry, defense attorney, who gave the presentation on the facts of the case and what happened. The public defender, Phyllis Alito, Aluka, actually, yeah. She gave a presentation on the facts of the case, what happened with respect to L persons, the accusations, how it was conducted, and leading up to the event itself. Then we had a panel discussion with educators on teaching this material. This was what I think the Tennessee law had passed by this point, and it's a high school teacher, a couple of college professors, and a young person from Bridges that talked about teaching and learning this subject matter. We had another panel was of the descendants. We had the descendants of Mr. Person, a descendant of the young woman who was accused of killing, and we had the descendant of one of the witnesses on a panel. And these three individuals have known each other for quite some time. And I've had dinner with them, and they're friends. And we love that panel because in today's society, people believe that if we talk about these things with one another, that all hell will break loose in the world. It won't. You might even enjoy one another's company as these three individuals. There's another session that we had with L person that's escaping me right now. Media, that's right. We had Otis Sanford. We had the editor of the new Tri-State Defender on the role. And well, I don't think Laura spoke. She might have interviewed, but she wasn't on the panel. She was on the sentence panel, or also moderator of that one. But they talked about the role of the media in that. If you read the descriptions of some of these events at the time, it's very, very slanted. You know, they talked about why that was and the effect of that, right? If you see many of these descriptions in the archives, they don't even have bylines. And we talked about, well, why don't they have bylines, right? So yeah, that was the second to last panel. This was at First Congo in October of last year. So using that sort of model with Jesse Lee Bond, yeah, we're giving ourselves some time to really think about that one. That's
We'll pray for it.
yes, please do. Any other comments, questions? I'm going to ask Randy to come up and introduce his friend. Wayne, introduce your friend, Wayne Dowdy. Did I not tell you this?
No, you didn't.
Because Randy's typically so shy.
Come on, you're not gonna give them a chance to talk.
They didn't give me nothing, they didn't give me nothing to write on.
Now,
That mic, Randy, I know you're loud, but the mic is on, the mic is on that one right there.
What can I say about Wayne Dowdy? I've been knowing him for a good while, since I like history. Wayne is the history department manager. I spent a lot of time in the history department with Wayne and all the other people that actually work there to get information, research and stuff like that. But Wayne is an amazing, he has written a book on slavery. He's written on Boy Scouts and a couple of other books that he's written. So I am grateful that we have Wayne, is because when we were meeting at Caritas, and Caritas in Ben Hampton shut down, we actually had a meeting on the actual fourth floor. And I talked with Wayne, and he actually spoke there back then. But he's an amazing historian, and I don't want to go too long because we're going to be here a good while with Wayne Dowdy.
Well, thank you, my friend. I appreciate that. It's been a pleasure to.
Oh, geez, I'm so sorry. That was just my friend. The Zoom people are on that one. Oh,
Okay.
right. Zoom people are on that one. So we should still be good.
Now I've lost my train of thought. Let's see. Let me get back to where I'm going. What I wanted to talk to y'all tonight a little bit is first briefly to talk about how one goes to research the enslaved, just for a second, and then to talk about the lives of those who lived that horrific experience. We've been led to believe that most of those stories are gone, and some of them are, to be sure, but by no means all of them are gone. In fact, there's a lot more out there than we were once led to believe. And this gives us an opportunity to tell their stories as opposed to what we normally see when we start talking about slavery is it ends up being about white people. Because too often historians have treated slaves as the other, just like they were treated at the time, as if they are not central to their own story. So what we're trying to do now is to tell those stories, to talk about those people who went through that experience and what their lives were like. And so tonight, I want to talk about 4 different people, enslaved people who lived in and around Memphis, and hopefully give you a better understanding of what life was like in an urban setting in the South. We often think of slavery as being on these large plantations, and it certainly was, but there were slaves who lived in cities as well, who did work in the cities, and their experiences in some cases are a little bit different than those who lived on the large plantations out in the countryside. I'm going to start with a young woman named Mary Herndon. Miss Herndon was born in the Indian Territory, which roughly speaking, what is now Oklahoma. She was brought to Cameron, Missouri by her first owner, where she nursed children and was a quote unquote sewing girl. So she worked inside the home, not outside the home. However, a few years later, her owner's property was seized for not paying taxes. So she was sold to Nathan Bedford Forrest. And she was bought by Forrest, sent by wagon to St. Louis, and then she boarded a steamboat for Memphis with a lot of other enslaved people. She stayed at the Forrest slave market for almost a year before she was eventually sold to a man named Lewis Fortner, who lived in Mason, Tennessee, who had a farm there. And Miss Herndon was at first brought into the home because that was her experience. That's the skill set she had. But the following spring, she was sent to the field. And she said in an interview that was conducted in 1933, "I chopped cotton, plowed it, and did everything any other slave done." This included training and breaking mules, which she did. And so she goes from developing skills inside the home to being a field hand, which is not what you want to be. You don't want to be a slave at all, of course, but to work in the field makes you even more disposable in terms of the hierarchy of how slavery worked. Herndon was on the Fortner farm about 1864 when a small union detachment came through and said, "Hey, y'all are free. Y'all can do what you want to." Well, of course, they didn't at first know what to do or where to go. So she stayed there. But the next morning she got up and the Mrs. Fortner gave her a hoe and said, "Get in the field." And she said, "No, I'm free now. I'm not going out in that field." So Mrs. Fortner took the hoe and slapped her upside the head, leaving a scar on her face for the rest of her life. But eventually, she did leave the Fortner farm, but she had no skills. She was young when she was a sewing girl, so she knew how to sew, but that wasn't an important skill either. She ended up drifting into Memphis and working odd jobs and was sadly a member of the disposable poor. She never made much money. No one took care of her. She was living in a small shack off downtown, off in South Memphis. And she was forgotten until a newspaper reporter in 1933 tracked her down and interviewed her and told her story. And he allowed her to tell that story about being hit with the hoe. So it wasn't just a sort of a plantation, everything was great back then, which of course it wasn't. But too often newspaper reporters love to tell that kind of story instead of some semblance of the truth. So Mary Herndon and her experiences is one kind of experience being an enslaved person. A slightly different one was that of a man named Lewis Hughes. Lewis Hughes was born in Virginia, and when he was 6 years old, he was sold with his mother and two brothers to a local doctor. And by Lewis's account, by Mr. Hughes's account, he was treated fairly well, but he died. And then the family was sold. And soon after they were sold, his new owner said, "Well, I'm gonna send you down on a canal boat to work the boat for a while, and they're going to pay me your wages and everything. You won't be gone too long." But his mother knew better. And he writes about seeing his mother, and he had a small bundle with everything that he owned, a few clothes, and that's about it. And she told him to always be proud and strong. And then he got on the boat thinking he was going to see her in a couple of months. Well, he arrives in Richmond, Virginia. And he's standing on the dock. And a white man says, you ain't working on no boat. You're being sold down the river. And he was sold. And he ended up at a plantation in Pontotoc, Mississippi, owned by the McGee family, Edmund McGee. And in 1850, McGee became so rich that he moved to Memphis, built a big house, and brought Lewis Hughes with him to work in the house. And Mr. Hughes was about 10 years old at this time. So he wasn't quite ready for field work anyway, and he had an affinity for it. And he became a servant in the house. His main job was to set the tables for each meal, to clean the front room, keep it spotless, and to do any other kinds of jobs that he wanted, that needed to be done. Mr. McGee was a tolerable man. Wasn't mean, wasn't particularly nice, and he owned slaves, so obviously he's got some issues there economically and also culturally. But his wife was mean as a snake. And Mrs. McGee loved nothing better than to just walk by Lewis and anybody else, Delia, who worked in the kitchen at the time, and just slap them upside the head or kick them, just for the hell of it. No particular reason, just because she felt like it. She had a terrible temper, and she took it out on the enslaved every chance they got. Now, Lewis, like most slaves, did not like his condition. Like all human beings, he wanted to be free. Lewis was fortunate in one sense, and that is that he lived in Memphis, which is next to the Mississippi River. Boats are coming in and out of Memphis all day, every day. And one day, when he was about 16 or 17, he decided it's time to go. He had watched how the boats worked. He understood where a good place would be to hide on a boat. And so he ran away one night, boarded a steamboat, crawled into the hold of the ship, laid on top of some cotton bales, and eventually the ship left and headed up north to Ohio. Now he stayed in that hole by himself. It was constantly dark, and there was no food and no water. And after about 3 days, he was hungry and he was parched. So he waited until the dead of night and decided to sneak into the galley to see if he could get some food and water. And he did, but unfortunately he was caught. They took him to Cincinnati, and he was essentially put on trial and to determine whether he was an enslaved person or not. And they found that he was. He said who his owner was. Advertisements were put in the newspaper while he sat in jail. And and McGee found out about him and traveled to Cincinnati and picked him up. Now, surprisingly, his first time, he was not whipped for escaping the first time. But the second time he escaped and was found, he was beaten to an inch of his life. They took him in the barn, they strung him up, and they whipped him over and over and over again. And then they tortured him further by using salt water to wash his back, which they had to have known would sting. But that didn't mean that Mr. Hughes was ready to give up. Escape was always on his mind. And he came to Memphis in 1850. So, of course, 10 years later, the election of Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War begins, and Hughes is determined even more to escape. And he has another reason. By 1860, he's now married, and he has 2 children, 2 young babies. He had married a woman named Matilda, who also had been bought by and sold by Nathan Bedford Forrest. And Matilda was actually a free woman who had been sold illegally, but no one cared except her. But she was a very proud, dignified woman who never forgot that she had been free. And this drove Mrs. McGee crazy because she didn't act deferentially enough to suit her. And when she had her children, Mrs. McGee basically decided that she was going to punish Matilda, Mrs. Hughes, for her behavior, for her countenance, for her dignified bearing. She would keep her away from her children as much as possible. She would put her to work, working harder than she had before. So much so that she could not nurse her children enough. And it was clear that the babies were dying. A doctor was called. The doctor said, "You got to let her nurse these children." Well, she didn't. And the 2 children died. Well, at first, Matilda did what most of us do, which is she turned to faith. But over time, she became angrier and angrier. And one day, she'd had enough. And Mrs. McGee noticed that she was out of sorts. And she said, "I'm going to take you out back and I'm going to whip you." And Matilda said, "No, you're not." And Mrs. McGee grabbed her and she fought back. Mr. McGee came in and almost choked her to death, but let her go and sent her back to her quarters. Well, she went back, packed what she had, and she left. She walked straight into Memphis, went to Nathan Bedford Forrest slave mart, and when Forrest saw her, he recognized her. And he said, "Matilda, what are you doing here?" And she said, "I don't care who you sell me to anybody. I'll go. I can't stand to be with the McGees anymore." And he said, "Well, I know those are hard people." And there was the main slave trader, a man named Collins, who was in the office at the time. And they began he was going to buy her until McGee showed up. And he said, "I won't sell her for anything." So she did go back home. And of course, the war came. And it's not until 1865 that McGee is able to escape. After the Battle of Shiloh, the McGees went back to Pontotoc. They left Memphis because it was soon occupied by Union forces. And in the summer of 1865, after the war is basically over, McGee and another man flees to Memphis. And they go by themselves because they feel like they're not going to be able to get their families out all at the same time. So they go to Memphis, they find some Union troops who go back with them and escort them back to Pontotoc and allow them to get their wives and their belongings onto a wagon. They go back to Memphis. McGee works in Memphis. They live in Memphis for about 2 months, and then they head north. And they end up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, eventually. He works at a number of hotels at first. He is able to be reunited with one of his brothers. And he ends up becoming a nurse. And when he dies in 1913, he is a well-respected member of the Milwaukee community. Now, another enslaved person from the McGee household was a man named Thomas Bland. Thomas was their driver. He took care of the horses, he took care of the wagons, and also the carriages that they used. And one day, he noticed that McGee had hired some plasterers to work on the house, to do some repair work. And they were enslaved people. They were working, and one of them was writing things down on a pad. He said, this guy can read and write. So he was able at some point to whisper to him, hey, can you teach me how to do this? And he says, yeah, come to my cabin tonight. Well, the plasterers were urban slaves who had skills that they had been taught. And then they were essentially allowed to work on their own, live on their own, as long as most of the wages were turned over to the owner. And if you think about it for a second, that's actually a very efficient but ugly way to do this, because they don't have to pay for room and board. They don't have to take care of these people. They just simply collect the money. Now, again, it's a horrible system. I don't mean to sound that it's efficient, doesn't mean good by any means. So Thomas, Mr. Bland, learns how to read and write. So he forges a pass that not only says that he can go into Memphis, but also says that he can hire out to do work for an unlimited amount of time. And he signs McGee's name. So he walks into town, goes to a riverboat, goes to the pilot house and says, I'm looking for a job. And the man says, well, I need somebody. So 24 hours later, he's in Ohio. Now, he eventually, within a couple of months' time, makes his way all the way to Canada. And when he's in Canada, he sits down and he writes a letter to Mr. McGee. And he says, guess what? I'm in Canada and you can't reach me. Thomas would eventually, Mr. Bland would eventually, he worked in hotels as well. And he eventually was reunited with Lewis Hughes for a time. And they worked for a time in the same hotel before Lewis eventually made his way to Milwaukee. Now, a fourth and final person I want to talk about real quick is a man named Henry Davidson. Henry Davidson was brought to Memphis by his owner when he was about 8 years old in 1826 in Memphis. Thomas Davidson was his owner's name. He was a Methodist preacher, and he was sent to Memphis to start Methodist missions here, which he did. He eventually founded several Methodist churches around the city and county, because he was a circuit riding preacher. He was a missionary preacher, which is to say he would go and establish churches, not necessarily remain the preacher for a long period of time. He would move on within the county. And he eventually became a very important member of the Methodist Church, but and a very well-respected man. So he brings Henry Davidson with him to Memphis. And Henry is very, very important to the building of these missions. And in fact, Henry is one of the reasons why the Wesley Chapel that was formed here in Memphis at first allowed enslaved people to attend churches, to attend church services. And then in the early 1840s, they deeded the basement of Wesley Chapel to the Wesley Chapel African Mission. The African Mission originally hired an African American preacher who had been a slave, and but who unfortunately died, and then a man named Collins became the pastor. And this would eventually lead to Collins Chapel CME Church. But Henry was extremely involved in the church. And he was recognized as one of the founders of what would become First Methodist Church downtown. He was a beloved member of that community and of the Davidson family as well. When the war came and Memphis was occupied by Union forces, Thomas P. Davidson went to Henry and said, "Look, I cannot keep you as a slave." And he lets him go, and he says, "I have nowhere to go. I don't have any family. I have no idea who my family is." So he stays with the Davidsons. And in fact, several generations of Davidsons would take care of him until he died in 1908. And when he died in 1908, he's buried in Elmwood. And not only was he recognized by everyone in Memphis as one of the founders of First Methodist Church, he was also, and as a result of that, the preacher, the pastor of First Methodist Church, the white pastor, preached his funeral. And in the description of the funeral and in the newspaper, you really can see that there was great affection by the Davidson family for Henry. Now, that does not wipe away the cruelty of slavery. But what we see in these four people's lives is the various aspects of how slavery existed, how slaves lived, and how they navigated through the world. Lewis Hughes, beaten and tortured, but still going on and becoming this important figure. Thomas Bland not only escaping, but getting revenge against McGee by writing that letter. Mary Herndon, a field hand who sadly was not able to have a prosperous life because of the discrimination and the cruelty of slavery. And then Henry Davidson, who not only had a huge impact on this community by supporting that church, but also shows that there were people who cruelly owned slaves, but nevertheless brought those people into their lives and they became family. That's a minority experience, to be sure. Some people like to think that was always the case. That was a very small, because obviously the McGees didn't give a damn about Thomas Bland or Lewis. But nevertheless, because these are human beings, white and black, They experience things in different ways, and it's like work in some ways, in the sense that you've had a boss that you hate, right? But even over time, you get to know each other, and you may not exactly like him, but maybe you understand a little bit and you recognize his humanity, if nothing else. And that can happen in close proximity. But again, it doesn't wipe away the sin of slavery by any means. And so let me just leave you with this, that the people who were enslaved must be remembered. And we've got to do everything we can to find out who they are, who they were, what they did, what their lives were like. Some are going to be lost, sadly, because there is no written record. But there is more of a written record than we think. And it is up to us to try and explore that and bring those people back to life so they can become part of our lives. Thank y'all.
I want to ask questions.
Yes, I'll be glad to answer any questions, of course.
It appears
Yes, sir.
that the Mississippi River must have been a well-traveled highway.
It was indeed.
Get from the south to Canada within 24 hours.
That, well, it was a little bit longer than that. He gets to Ohio in 24 hours. It's a little longer before he gets to Canada. But there's no question about that. And it was a highway of freedom for a lot of people. And it is clear that Memphis was a destination for runaway slaves. You can see the advertisements in the newspapers. There are people from as far away as Virginia who are being captured and arrested here and being held for their owners. And it makes perfect sense. The river is a perfect place to try and escape from. And Memphis is an urban center. You can hide in plain sight. There are going to be African-American people walking up and down the streets every day during the day. Now at night, you're going to legally, you got to be indoors, but during the day, it's not going to be surprising to see blacks walking down the street. Whereas if you were on some country road, they'd be wanting to know, why are you there? Because somebody's going to come by and want to know why this person is walking down the road by themselves. So there's more freedom of movement, and the police cannot stop everybody to find out whether they have a written pass to be on the street. So it definitely is a way for runaways too, and the river is the main thing. Yes, sir.
Also, I noticed you talked about the Methodist Church.
Mm-hmm.
It appeared that the CME Church, Christian Methodist.
That's right.
Had a big beginning here in this area.
It did indeed, and very much so. Until Kojic, which of course was essentially founded here, and this is the home headquarters of that denomination. Before that, Memphis was primarily a Methodist town. I mean, there were a lot of Baptists and Episcopalians and Catholics and so on, but the Methodist Church had a huge impact, as Kojic does now, on the city. Absolutely. Listen. Yes, ma'am.
You were talking about preserving the stories, and you mentioned that the lady was interviewed. How did the other histories, how did you get the other?
That's an excellent question. Henry Davidson was in the newspaper a couple of times. So his obituary particularly told most of the story. But, and then looking at how the Wesley Chapel and the African Mission were created and all of that. So the newspapers are an excellent source for a lot of this. Then the story of Thomas Bland and Lewis Hughes, actually in 1903, Lewis Hughes wrote his memoir and told all of these stories and a lot more besides. And it was essentially lost. It was self-published. It was never a part of sort of the slave narratives that were created before the war, that were so popular. And it kind of got lost until a publisher about 10 years ago republished it, and made it available. It's also available if you do Kindle. There's a free copy of that book, of that memoir, on Kindle. So fortunately, he told the story, and sometimes you have to, not these stories, but there are other stories that I've looked at where you sort of have to read between the lines, because the newspapers were notoriously racist in many ways and would describe these things in very plantation-like, Gone with the Wind-like terms, and love to use dialect. People didn't talk like that. And I mean, we all living down here have our own way of talking. We truncate things and we have sayings we use, but I mean, people don't talk like that. That's not a human way of talking. But a lot of times the newspaper stories were written sort of to pat white people on the back after slavery. But there's a ton of stories about formerly enslaved people in the newspapers from the 1880s until the early 1930s. The commercial appeal loved to find stories like that. Part of it was a nostalgia thing. Part of it was very patronizing to make white people feel good, like, hey, we're taking care of these people. We're doing right by them. Well, there's many more cases of not being done right than there are of the few like Henry Davidson. And so sometimes, but it still contains information that's useful. There's a story of a man named Horace Mayweathers who was able to reconnect with one of his brothers because he was working in the Gayoso House Hotel here, and a white man came in who was from like St. Louis, and he said, you look like a guy who works in a hotel in St. Louis. And he said, did you have a brother? Well, yeah, I did have a brother. So he said, well, I'll tell you what, next time I'm in St. Louis, I'll look him up. And he gave him his name, and his name was completely made up because he wasn't named Horace by his owner. When he was freed, he liked the name Horace Mayweather for whatever reason. So that's what he named himself. But he said, who owned you? And so he took that information, went back, and a couple of months later, the guy came back through Memphis, and he had a letter from his brother and said, here it is. And so they reconnected and actually were able to meet and everything. Now, the newspaper article is written more about the white guy than it is about Horace Mayweather's and his brother. But it still contains the information we want, which is they were reconnected. But of course, we have to remember that it was slave owners, whites, who pulled them apart in the first place. So we have to remember, we can say, oh, that's a wonderful story, and it is. But there's a bigger story behind this that they should have never been split up in the first place. So, yeah, so there's a lot of that, but it's wonderful sources for all these people's lives, even if it's written for reasons other than what we want to use it for, but it's still useful. Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
I want to ask a question. I'm old enough to remember having to go to the library on Thursday.
Yes, I'm fans. Yes, sir.
Is there anybody? I never learned how to use the library.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way that any service that the library offers to teach people how to research through old newspapers? Because I don't know.
Come up to the fourth floor. We'll teach you anytime you want.
I mean, they got 5 minutes.
Well, yeah, okay. Come back You can always ask for me. But we should be getting better, we should be giving better service than that. Why don't we do this? And this is true for anybody who wants. Come up, and if you want, I'll give you my phone number and my email address too. I don't think, I may have a card. Okay. And we can set up a time for anybody who wants. Maybe we're not understanding your need, and so that's our fault. But we can sit down with you for a while and walk you through the
I'm
steps.
just part of one. Can the library work out a program for lay people?
Mm-hmm.
Because the average African American don't know what it is.
Right.
About
Well,
how to use the library to do everything.
it's an excellent point. What I'll do is bring that up the chain and I'll talk to you. But in the meantime, anybody who wants any instruction can come to the 4th floor. But that's an excellent point to have an actual class. Because, we do offer computer classes where we teach you, all the basics of all kinds of, not just how to use a computer, but how to use particular databases like Excel and, all that kind of stuff. So that's an excellent idea that probably nobody has ever had the thought to do. So I'll talk to our people and see if we can't set that up. Libraries for seniors probably is what we need. Because we reach out to the young people, but I know this from my own personal experience, having crossed the river and now on the older side, that we get forgotten about, like we know everything, or we're not important enough to know anything. So no, that's an excellent idea, and I'll bring it up, and I'm not the one who creates those, so my power is limited, but I will definitely bring it up to see if we can't create something like that. But again, please come back, and please let us do a better job. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yes, Susan.
You used to do some genealogy.
We did.
classes, like 4 different sessions.
Right. And to hate to sound like a broken record, probably everybody knows what a broken record is in here. The pandemic wiped all that away, but we're getting back. And we've had some, again, crossing the river, we've had some health issues with some of our staff, and we've had some things that is limited, but absolutely we're going to do that. And what would be a good idea is to maybe do a 5th session on how to use the library. And maybe that's one way we can help some of that divide, because we can do that on our own. And also to give a plug specifically for the Orange Mound Library, which is going to be opening. We're supposed to have some sort of an event next month, but it's nowhere near ready. So it's probably going to be February or March before it's really available for folks to come in. But what it is, the ground floor of the old Melrose High School will have a genealogy center on one side and a library on the other in the lobby, the 1st floor. And then above that is going to be senior housing. In Orange Mound? On Dallas at the old high school. At the old high school. Yes, sir.
On the 2nd floor.
The second, that's going to be housing. Senior housing. So there are folks that are going to be living there above where the library and the genealogy center is. And there definitely will be workshops and things like that. But I'm going to follow through on that. Definitely. Yes, Randy.
You had mentioned Orange Mound, which was also started by Plantation. My question is, because your book was on enslavement in Memphis, has there been anything written collaboratively around Shelby County, the plantations?
No, there never has been.
Of course, I know in Orange Mound, Park Avenue, right, there was a dedication for those who were actually enslaved.
The ones we know that were in the probate record, the will, yes, yeah. So that's a small amount.
the correlation between the slave owners in Memphis and also the slave owners in Shelby County.
No question, there's the amount of work that has been done is almost minuscule. In fact, we get questions all the time about where the plantations were. And we know of the Dedrick plantation.
We know the Davis Manor.
We know Davies Manor, and we know one or two others.
Yeah.
But we really don't know where the farms were and plantations. Yes, sir.
You don't have a plantation or university place? That was a big.
No, see, that's the thing, and
Project over there, and we found all kind of artifacts.
wonderful. That's wonderful. We need to tell that story. And see, all of that, so it's like what Rich was talking about earlier about, there's so much opposition to telling the story, which is now, originally, it was just polite society and cultural opposition. Now it's legal opposition. And, but the fight will continue. But, we've got to explore all that because there are records out there. Yes, sir.
What do you mean by legal opposition?
Well, the law that was passed about the schools, and you can't, the lecture I just gave you, from my understanding, couldn't be taught in public schools.
Yeah, but you
in
can
the
still
state.
develop the ideas.
To be sure,
Yeah.
but there's clearly political and legal opposition to some of this. And so, yeah, so, at least the way I'm reading it, now other people obviously can disagree, but from my way of thinking, that's what's happening. Because when you say, well, you can't teach slavery because it's gonna make white people feel bad, that sounds awful legal, that sounds awful political to me. But, right, absolutely. And what's my feelings got to do with it anyway? I don't think either. So yeah.
Wayne, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Comment that what stuck out for me very vividly was definitely the horror of it,
Mhm.
but also the resilience and the fact of a non-victimhood
Mhm.
that many people, enslaved people,
Right, they just wanted to get on with their lives.
Just
Yes.
amazing.
And what we forget is, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to talk. Is what we forget is these are human beings, just like us. They feel the same things we feel, and so anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
Thanks again to Wayne. Now I would just really open the floor really informally. Any further questions about LSP? But before that, I know some of you came and was wondering how you could get involved. And there's one particular thing that we are doing that that is really, really important to us. I think everyone in here can help out with that. And some of you have heard me talk about this. And that's the Elk Persons National Park Service drive. Now, any of you who have been to a national park, it's a thing, right? And typically we think of those vast stretches of land out west, but there has been a movement within the National Park Service to recognize things in the South relating to civil rights and to Black people. So I mentioned we wrote a letter to Biden, and we testified before Congress. Cohen sponsored a bill to get the Elk Person site into the National Park Service. The National Park Service response was, hey, it's not really of national import what happened to Elk Persons. Of course, we think it is. There are a number of reasons why. James Weldon Johnson of the NAACP came down and investigated. Actually, the local NAACP was founded as a direct result of the Elk Persons lynching. They mentioned the Elk Persons lynching on the floor of Congress when they first tried to pass anti-lynching legislation over 100 years ago. The president of the United States at the time talked about the Elk Persons lynching. But we're in the realm that's relatively new for this organization of we have to start talking to politicians and letting them know, we have to start talking to politicians and letting them know that, hey, this is important to us, to your constituents. Earlier, so Colin, of course, he has been a longtime supporter of LSP. He's been to our meetings before. But as you know, the large part of Tennessee is red. And we have set up calls, we've had calls with representatives of our national delegation in the state, other members of the House of Representatives. We've had calls with them just to introduce ourselves and what we do. And what we would like to do is to write letters for people who are LSP supporters, to write letters to our politicians to let them know, hey, we would really like it if the L Person site was in the National Park Service. Please consider this. Please consider the work of LSP. Just that simple act. And we hope to really start a letter writing campaign early next year. So if you've signed up, if you haven't signed up, there's a sign up sheet over there. We'll be sending out that information to our constituency to join that. So. Hey, Ben.
At one point in time, I did talk to Mayor Strickland.
Oh.
Fairly recently.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I recall, in terms of what recent. A few months ago maybe. And he said at any time that we needed it, he was prepared to send a letter.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I know he'll
Right.
go out of
Transition.
office, but would you like something before? And if so, can we just talk and?
Yeah, we can talk about that. Yeah.
To have this letter?
Yeah, let's talk about, because I'm wondering, because the letter writing campaign I'm thinking of is, of course, to our, the reps. I don't know how many people live in Shelby County. If you live outside of Shelby County, that's great too. Sending it to our own representative, because of course that means more to the local reps. But we can talk about who would be best for him to send that letter to.
Okay.
Also.
I thought it was, yeah.
I didn't know.
I think it was you. Go ahead, Sam.
Okay, I heard Pam speak of the resiliency of the enslaved people. And the book club explains that we have a book club, right? So even though it takes us a year or two to do a book, and it's a reason for that, because we want to involve our mind, body, and soul in reading this book and understanding. Because I think our last book was My Grandmother's Hands, spoke to the trauma of racism. So we got something for all aspects. Come back, look it up.
You can tie the book club into your readers, your listeners.
Yeah.
You can mention that now that there's a book club. And
Yes,
that
there is a book
they could join a webinar.
Sam, do you guys do webinars? I don't think that they do webinars. It's a pretty tight knit group. Yes.
They do Zoom.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, the meeting's over. Feel free to mingle and talk with others who are in LSP. I got to get my two little girls home. I wish I could stay and talk with everyone. But thank you so much for coming out. We'll be having another road shows at the beginning, early next year in the spring. Thank you so much. Oh, we have our meetings every second Monday of the month, with the exception of August. Yeah. Okay. At the Barth House. If you signed in, we'll have your email. We'll have you on the newsletter, so you'll get our newsletters, and they'll let you know as well. Yeah.